July 14th, 1941. The Western Front, near the Belarusian town of Orsha. The German 5th Panzer Division has just captured a vital railway junction. The soldiers are unloading ammunition trains. They are confident. They have been advancing for 3 weeks without pause. The Red Army is retreating in chaos. The war, the German High Command believes, will be over before the snow falls. Then they hear it. At first it is nothing, a whisper on the wind, a sound so distant that the men ignore it. But the whisper grows. It becomes a whine. The whine becomes a howl, a high-pitched, rising shriek that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the sky, from the trees, from the ground beneath their feet. The German soldiers look up. The sky is falling. Not bombs, not shells, something else, something they have never seen before. Streaks of fire, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, raining down from the clouds with a sound like tearing metal. The ground erupts, not in one place, everywhere. The ammunition trains explode. The trucks vanish. The men simply disappear, torn apart by shrapnel that flies in every direction at once. When it is over, and it is over in less than 10 seconds, the survivors stumble through the smoke, trying to understand what has just happened. They have been bombed by aircraft, they think, but there are no aircraft in the sky. They have been shelled by artillery. But no artillery battery in the world can fire that many rounds that quickly. The German officers demand answers. The answers come from the intelligence services days later. The Soviets have deployed a new weapon, a secret weapon, a multiple rocket launcher mounted on a truck. The Germans give it a name, Stalin's organ, because of the sound. That terrible, howling, screaming sound. This is the story of that weapon. To understand why Stalin's organ was so terrifying, you have to understand what the Red Army was facing in the summer of 1941. On June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft crossed the Soviet border in a surprise attack that shattered the Red Army's defenses. The Soviet Air Force lost more than 1,000 aircraft on the first day alone, most of them destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Asterisk by mid-July, German forces had advanced more than 300 miles into Soviet territory. They had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. They had destroyed entire Soviet armies. The Red Army was in full retreat, abandoning equipment, ammunition, and hope. The Soviet Union was losing the war. Not slowly, catastrophically. In those desperate weeks, the Red Army needed anything that could slow the German advance. They needed weapons that were cheap, easy to produce, and capable of delivering massive firepower without requiring the sophisticated logistics that had been destroyed in the retreat. They needed the Katyusha. The Katyusha was not invented in 1941. It was the product of more than a decade of secret research, work that had been conducted in the deepest secrecy behind the walls of laboratories that did not officially exist. Asterisk research into solid propellant rockets in the Soviet Union began in the 1920s at the Gas Dynamics Laboratory, GDL, in Leningrad. The first test of a solid fuel rocket took place in March 1928. The rocket flew for about 1,300 meters, not far by modern standards, but far enough to prove that the concept worked. Asterisk in the early 1930s. The work moved to the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, RNII, in Moscow. Here, a team of brilliant engineers, including Georgy Langmack and a young Sergei Korolev, who would later become the father of the Soviet space program, developed the RS-82 and RS-132 rockets. The letters RS stood for Reaktivny Snaryad, rocket-powered shell. These rockets were originally designed for aircraft. They could be fired from fighters and bombers to attack ground targets and enemy planes. But the military saw another possibility. What if you mounted multiple rockets on a single vehicle? What if you could fire them all at once, creating a saturation bombardment that no conventional artillery battery could match? Asterisk in August 1939, the first prototype of the BM-13 was completed. BM stood for Boivaya Mashina, combat vehicle. The number 13 referred to the 132 mm caliber of the rockets. The launcher was mounted on a ZS-6 truck, a Soviet-made vehicle with 3 axles and all-wheel drive. But the artillery branch of the Red Army was not impressed. They pointed out that the Katyusha was less accurate than conventional artillery. They noted that it took up to 50 minutes to reload the launcher, time during which a conventional howitzer could fire 95 to 150 rounds. They argued that the rockets were unreliable, that the launcher was fragile, that the weapon had no place on a modern battlefield. And so, despite the successful tests, only 40 BM-13 launchers were built before the German invasion. The invasion changed everything. There is a shadow behind the Katyusha story, a shadow that the Soviet authorities tried for decades to hide. Asterisk Georgy Langmack, one of the chief designers of the RS-132 rocket, was arrested in 1937 during the Great Purge. He was accused of treason, a standard charge in those years, often used to eliminate anyone who had made the mistake of impressing Stalin. Langmack was tortured. He was tried in a secret court. He was convicted, and in 1938, he was executed. Asterisk. He was 40 years old. Langmack never saw his rockets in combat. He never heard the howl of Stalin's organ. He never knew that his work would become one of the most feared weapons of the war. He died in a prison cell, executed by the same government that would later claim his inventions as proof of Soviet genius. Sergei Korolev, Langmack's colleague, narrowly escaped the same fate. He was arrested in 1938, sent to a gulag in Siberia, and nearly died there. He was released only in 1944 after the Katyusha had already proven itself on the battlefield. Korolev would go on to lead the Soviet space program, the man who put Sputnik in orbit, who launched Yuri Gagarin into space. But he never forgot the prison camps. He never forgot what happened to Langmack. The Katyusha was born in blood, not just the blood of the soldiers who fired it, but the blood of the men who designed it. Asterisk on the night of July 13th, 1941, a secret battery of the new rocket launchers moved toward the front lines. The battery was commanded by Captain Ivan Flerov, a 36-year-old artillery officer who had been personally selected to lead the 1st Katyusha unit. His men were volunteers. They had been sworn to secrecy. They had been told that if they were captured, they were to destroy their vehicles at any cost, even if it meant their own lives. Asterisk. Asterisk, the battery consisted of 7 BM-13 launchers, the only 7 in existence. They were mounted on ZS-6 trucks, painted in standard military green, with the launching rails hidden under tarpaulins. The rockets themselves, 132 mm M13 rounds, each weighing 42 kilograms, each carrying a warhead of 4.9 kilograms of high explosive, were stored in crates, handled with the care normally reserved for newborn children. Asterisk. Flerov's target was the Orsha railway station, which had just been captured by the German 5th Panzer Division. The station was a critical supply hub for the German advance. Ammunition trains, fuel trucks, and food supplies were being unloaded there, preparing for the next push east. Flerov positioned his battery on high ground overlooking the station. The range was about 5 kilometers, close enough for accuracy, far enough to avoid immediate detection. His men removed the tarpaulins. They raised the launching rails. They loaded 16 rockets onto each of the 7 launchers. At 3:15 p.m. on July 14, 1941, Flerov gave the order. Fire. The first salvo lasted 7 seconds. 7 launchers, each firing 16 rockets. 112 rockets in total. More than 500 kilograms of high explosives. Traveling at more than 300 meters per second. Arriving on target in less than 20 seconds. The effect was beyond anything Flerov could have imagined. The German survivors later reported that the ground had seemed to lift up and shake itself apart. The railway station was reduced to rubble. The ammunition trains exploded in massive fireballs that rose hundreds of meters into the air. The men who had been unloading supplies simply vanished. German intelligence was baffled. The reports described a bombardment so intense that it could only have been delivered by a full artillery division, but there was no artillery division in the area. The Germans concluded that the Soviets must have developed some kind of secret weapon. They were right. Flerov's battery continued to fight, striking German positions behind the lines, always moving, always firing, always disappearing before the Germans could respond. But on October 7, 1941, near the village of Bogodar in western Russia, the battery was ambushed by German forces. The launchers were destroyed, on Flerov's orders, to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Flerov himself was killed. He was 36 years old. He did not live to see the Katyusha become legend. But the legend had already begun. The BM-13 Katyusha was, at its core, a remarkably simple weapon. Simplicity was its genius. The launcher consisted of 8 I-beam rails mounted on a rotating frame. Each rail carried 2 rockets, one above, one below, for a total of 16 rockets per vehicle. When the crew fired the weapon, an electrical current ignited the rockets in sequence, launching them in a ripple that took only 7 to 10 seconds to complete. The M13 rocket was a simple design as well. It was 80 centimeters long, 13.2 centimeters in diameter, and weighed 42 kilograms. The warhead, containing 4.9 kilograms of TNT, was at the front. The rocket motor, a steel tube filled with solid nitrocellulose propellant, was at the back. For stabilizer fins, made of pressed steel, kept the rocket from tumbling in flight. There was no guidance system. There were no adjustments for wind or temperature or any of the variables that conventional artillery gunners had to calculate. The Katyusha was not designed to hit a single target. It was designed to hit an area, a large area. A single BM, 13 salvo, 16 rockets, could saturate an area of 400,000 square meters. That is the size of about 56 football fields. The explosive power of that salvo was roughly equivalent to 72 conventional howitzers firing simultaneously. But the true advantage of the Katyusha was not its firepower. It was its mobility. A conventional artillery battery required hours to move into position, unlimber the guns, set up ammunition caches, and calculate firing solutions. The Katyusha could drive into position, fire, and be gone before the enemy could organize counter-battery fire. A trained crew could fire a full salvo in 10 seconds and be driving away in 30. By the time the first German shells landed on the position the Katyusha had occupied, the Katyusha was already kilometers away. This was a revolutionary concept. Shoot and scoot artillery. Modern armies take this for granted today. In 1941, it was terrifying. The German troops who faced the Katyusha learned to fear not just the explosions, but the silence that followed. Because when the rockets stopped falling, the launchers were already gone. There was nothing to shoot back at, nothing to take revenge upon, only the smoking craters and the dead. This is one of the strangest details of the Katyusha story. One of the most iconic weapons of the Red Army was mounted on an American truck. Asterisk the ZS-6 truck, the original Katyusha platform, had serious limitations. It was underpowered. It lacked all-wheel drive in most configurations. Its off-road performance was poor. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, ZS-6 trucks frequently became stuck, leaving the precious Katyusha launchers immobilized and vulnerable to German counterattacks. Asterisk. The solution arrived not from Soviet factories, but from across the ocean. Asterisk the United States, under the Lend-Lease program, sent thousands of Studebaker US-6 trucks to the Soviet Union. The Studebaker was a 6x6 all-wheel drive vehicle with a powerful engine, robust suspension, and excellent off-road capability. It could traverse mud that would swallow a ZIS-6 hole. It could climb hills that other trucks could not attempt. And it was reliable, perhaps the most reliable truck on the Eastern Front. Asterisk. Asterisk the Soviets quickly recognized that the Studebaker was the ideal platform for the Katyusha. In 1943, the BM-13N was developed. The N stood for Normalizovany, meaning standardized. The BM-13N mounted the Katyusha launcher on the Studebaker US-6 chassis. More than 1,800 of these vehicles were produced by the end of the war. Asterisk. The combination was devastating. The Studebaker gave the Katyusha the mobility it needed to survive and strike. The Katyusha gave the Studebaker a purpose far more dramatic than hauling supplies. Together, they became the most feared artillery system on the Eastern Front. The irony was not lost on the Germans, who were fighting against American trucks, carrying Soviet rockets, designed by a team that included a man who would later lead the American space program's rival. The Katyusha was not just a Soviet weapon. It was a global weapon, a product of American industry, Soviet engineering, and a German terror. Every great weapon acquires nicknames. The Katyusha had two, one from its enemies, one from its users. The Germans called it Stalin's organ. The name came from two things. First, the visual appearance. The multiple launch rails on the truck resembled the pipes of a church organ. Second, and more importantly, the sound. The rockets made a distinctive high-pitched howl as they flew, rising and falling in pitch as they accelerated. German soldiers who heard that sound for the first time described it as the shriek of the damned or the devil's choir. The name was not meant to be respectful. It was meant to be fearful. Stalin's organ was the instrument of Stalin's terror, an unholy weapon that announced itself with a sound like nothing else on earth. But the Soviet soldiers had a different name. They called it Katyusha. Katyusha is a Russian diminutive of the name Ekaterina, Catherine. It is an affectionate name, the kind of name you would use for a beloved daughter or a sweetheart. And it came from a song. In 1938, the composer Matvey Blanter and the poet Mikhail Isakovsky wrote a popular song about a girl named Katyusha who stands on a riverbank, singing a love song to her beloved who is serving in the army far away. The song was a hit. Soldiers sang it around campfires. Civilians sang it in the streets. Katyusha became a symbol of loyalty, love, and longing. When the new rocket launchers appeared in 1941, the soldiers noticed that they had a secret marking, the letter K stenciled on the launcher frame. The K stood for the Voronezh Comintern factory, where the launchers were built. But the soldiers assigned a different meaning. The K stood for Katyusha. The weapon was the beloved girl sending her love to the front. The contrast is striking. To the Germans, Katyusha was an organ of death, Stalin's organ, a weapon of terror. To the Soviet soldiers, Katyusha was a girl, a sweetheart, a comfort, a promise that someone was waiting for them to come home. The same weapon, two different worlds. We have mentioned the sound, but the sound deserves its own consideration. Asterisk the M13 rocket was propelled by a solid fuel motor that burned unevenly. As the propellant burned, the pressure inside the combustion chamber fluctuated, causing the rocket's exhaust to pulse. The result was not a steady roar like a jet engine. It was a howl, a rising, falling, wavering shriek that seemed almost alive. Asterisk. German veterans of the Eastern Front described the sound in their memoirs with a consistency that is striking. It was like nothing I had ever heard, one wrote. It was like the wind screaming through the pipes of a giant organ. It was like the voices of the dead. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who could endure conventional artillery barges, who had learned to sleep through the whistle of incoming shells and the crump of explosions, found that they could not endure the sound of the Katyusha. It got inside their heads. It bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the primitive fear centers of the brain. This was not accidental. The designers of the rocket did not intentionally create the howl. It was a byproduct of the solid fuel motor. But the Soviet commanders learned to use it. They learned that the sound of the Katyusha alone could break an enemy attack, could send veteran soldiers running from their positions, could spread panic through entire battalions. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, about a German officer who was captured after a Katyusha bombardment. He was asked by his Soviet captors why his men had fled so quickly. He replied, "We could see that you had no artillery. We thought you were using some kind of devil's weapon. The sound alone was enough to make us run. It was the sound of an industrial nation throwing its full weight into the war. It was the sound of the assembly line translated into terror." By 1943, the Katyusha had become a standard part of Red Army artillery doctrine. The Soviets organized entire regiments of Guards mortars, the official name for Katyusha units, each equipped with dozens of launchers. These regiments were used in mass concentrations. They would wait for the moment when the German forces were most vulnerable, when they were massing for an attack, or when they were retreating in column, or when they were packed into a staging area preparing for a major operation. Then the Katyushas would fire. All at once, hundreds of rockets, thousands of kilograms of high explosives, falling in less than 30 seconds. The result was not just destruction. It was erasure. Villages that had been held by German troops would vanish from the map. Road junctions would become crater fields. Assembly areas would become killing grounds. One German veteran described a Katyusha attack in a letter home. The earth shook as if in a fever. The air was filled with the howling of the rockets and the screaming of the wounded. Men who had been laughing 5 minutes before were now lying in pieces. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I do not know how I survived. Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized the artillery offensive, the use of massive artillery concentrations to prepare the way for infantry and armor. The Katyusha was the perfect weapon for this doctrine. Its rockets could saturate a target area in seconds, suppressing German defenses and creating chaos behind the lines. Then the Katyushas would move, racing to a new position to support the next phase of the attack. The mobility of the Katyusha, especially the Studebaker-mounted BM-13N, allowed the Soviets to do something that no army had ever done before. They could bring devastating artillery fire to any point on the battlefield at any time with almost no warning. Conventional artillery had to be positioned in advance, registered on targets, and supplied with ammunition. The Katyusha could drive to a new position, fire, and be gone before the Germans could respond. Asterisk. The Germans adapted as best they could. They learned to listen for the sound of Katyusha engines. They established listening posts to detect the rocket launches. They developed counter-battery tactics specifically designed to hunt down the elusive Stalin's organs. But the Katyushas were always faster, always one step ahead. By the end of the war, the Soviets had produced more than 10,000 Katyusha launchers of all types and more than 12 million rockets. The numbers are staggering, but numbers alone cannot capture what the Katyusha meant to the men who fired it and the men who faced it. But the Katyusha had a dark side for its users as well. The launchers were fragile. They had no armor. The rockets themselves were highly flammable. They were, after all, propelled by solid fuel. A single bullet or shell fragment in the wrong place could turn a Katyusha into a fireball. The crews knew this. They lived with this knowledge every day. They knew that their vehicles were rolling bombs. They knew that if they were hit while reloading, while the rockets were exposed, waiting to be loaded onto the rails, the explosion would kill everyone within 100 meters. And yet they continued to serve. They continued to drive toward the front lines. They continued to fire their rockets and then race away, knowing that the next salvo might be their last. There's a photograph from 1943 that captures this reality perfectly. It shows the burned-out wreck of a BM-13 Katyusha on a Studebaker chassis. The truck is blackened, the tires melted, the launcher rails twisted by the heat of the fire that consumed the vehicle. There is no crew visible in the photograph. The crew is gone. They disappeared in the fire. This is the cost of victory. This is the price of Stalin's organ. The Katyusha was not a weapon for the faint of heart. It was a weapon for men who understood that they might not survive the war, but who believed that their sacrifice would help end it. The war ended in May 1945. The Katyusha had done its job. The Germans were defeated. The Red Army had driven from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin. But the Katyusha did not disappear. It evolved. The lessons learned from the Katyusha shaped Soviet artillery doctrine for the rest of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, continued to develop multiple rocket launcher systems. The BM-21 Grad, which entered service in the 1960s, was a direct descendant of the Katyusha. The BM-27 Urigan and BM-30 Smerch that followed were even more powerful. Today, the concept of the multiple rocket launcher, the idea of saturating a target area with massive firepower in seconds, then quickly moving to avoid counter-battery fire, is standard practice in armies around the world. The American M270 MLRS, the German Lars, the Israeli LAR-160 all trace their lineage indirectly to the Katyusha *. But the Katyusha was more than a technical innovation. It was a symbol. For the Soviet people, the Katyusha represented the triumph of ingenuity over the German war machine. It was a weapon that had been designed in secret, produced in desperation, and deployed with devastating effect. It was the physical embodiment of Soviet resistance, the proof that the Red Army, even in its darkest hours, could still strike back. For the German soldiers who heard its howl, the Katyusha was something else, a reminder that the war they had started would come back to them with interest, that the technology they had dismissed as primitive could kill them just as effectively as any German weapon, that the Soviets, for all their supposed backwardness, had created something new and terrible. And for the soldiers who fired it, the men of the Guards mortar regiments, the Katyusha was a lifeline. It was the weapon that could break an enemy attack, the weapon that could silence German guns, the weapon that could bring them home alive. The note said that on December 20th, 1943. No, that is from a different story. The note from this story is simpler. The Katyusha was cheap. It was mobile. It was devastating. It was produced in numbers that the Germans could not match. It was, in the end, the perfect weapon for a war of attrition. A war in which the side that could produce the most weapons and deliver them to the battlefield fastest would ultimately prevail. And that side was the Soviet Union. During war, the one that controls the sky is the one that has the most reliable machine. But on the ground, on the frozen fields of the Eastern Front, the war was decided by firepower. And no weapon delivered firepower like Stalin's organ. The Katyusha did not win the war alone. The war was won by millions of men, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of aircraft, and the industrial might of the Soviet Union and its allies. But the Katyusha was there for all of it. From the desperate defense of Moscow in 1941 to the final assault on Berlin in 1945. And when the soldiers heard that sound, the howl, the shriek, the devil's choir, they knew what was coming. They knew that the earth was about to shake. They knew that the sky was about to fall. They knew that Stalin's organ was singing.